Good morning everyone and welcome to our Disability Hustings webinar, jointly hosted by Disability Equality Scotland and the Health and Social Care Alliance Scotland. Ahead of this year's Scottish Parliament elections on the 6th of May, we have invited representatives from the main political parties in Scotland to discuss a range of topics affecting disabled people. My name is Morven Brooks and I am the Chief Executive Officer at Disability Equality Scotland. I am joined today by Pennie Taylor, an award-winning freelance journalist and broadcaster. Thank you for joining us today, Pennie. Pennie will be chairing today's hustings. First of all, let me explain how today's session will run and how you can interact with us. We've received questions in advance of today, and these will be presented to the panel as well as providing you the opportunity to submit your questions. To do so, just type your question into the Q&A box in the bottom control panel. As time allows, the panel will address as many questions as they can during the Q&A session. Please can I ask you to keep your questions as short as possible. If you would prefer to ask panellists a question directly, please say so in the Q&A box and we can select you to speak. At this point, you will have to manually unmute yourself to be heard. If you would like to submit a question through a BSL interpreter, please let us know in the Q&A box. You will then be temporarily added to the panel to communicate via the interpreter. You do need to make sure your video is on. If you're having any technical difficulties at all using Zoom, please type your issue into the chat box and we'll address this and resolve this as quickly as possible for you. Today we have live captioning provided by Laura Harrison. If you would like to view the closed captioning for today's session, click the button that says closed caption and they will appear on your screen. We are also joined by Elizabeth Mooney and Eddie Foley from Sign Language Interactions, who will be providing British Sign Language support for us today. We will be recording this webinar and we will share the link after the event. We have also prepared a short feedback survey for all attendees to complete. This will help us improve the experience of future webinars. Before we start, if I can ask that if you are having any trouble hearing me or any panellists throughout the webinar, please let us know in the chat box and we will try to resolve this. To set today in context, both Disability Equality Scotland and the Alliance, we've both published our manifestos. Both organisations plea for a fairer and healthier Scotland, where the next Scottish Government must support and work with disabled people, people living with long-term conditions, unpaid carers, and the third sector. Let me start by introducing our panel today. We have Monica Lennon from the Scottish Labour Party, Jeremy Balfour from the Scottish Conservative Party, Gillian Mackay from the Scottish Greens Party, Karen Lindsay from the Scottish Liberal Democrats Party, and Emma Roddick from the Scottish National Party. I'm now delighted to introduce you to Pennie Taylor. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Morven, and thank you for asking me to be involved. As you've heard, I'm a journalist, I'm a health and social care specialist, and absolutely passionate about all things inclusion. So it's been fascinating to be involved in the process of looking at the questions that have come in advance of this hustings. We've drawn themes from those questions because there are far too many to ask, individually. So forgive me if your absolute wording hasn't been used, but I promise you, I hope you'll feel that the sentiment of your concerns are coming through. So we've met our panel. I wondered if I could just start us off to get used to things like the chat function. Could you use the chat function? And that involves clicking on the icon. If you roll your cursor over the bottom of your Zoom screen, you'll see the chat. Tell us where you're sitting right now as we start our conversation. Our first question is, as we all know, disabled people have been disproportionately impacted by the COVID pandemic. Higher rates of death and illness, COVID infection, and on top of that, withdrawn care packages in some instances that haven't yet been reinstated more than a year on. I'm going to ask each of our panelists to tell us, what would you do if elected, to ensure that that can never, ever happen again? I wonder if I could go to Jeremy Balfour first.
Good morning, Penny, and good morning, everybody. It's lovely not to be able to, well, it's not to be able to see you, but at least to be able to take your questions. And can I thank the Alliance and others for putting on this event this morning. I think the first thing we need to do is have a full, proper public inquiry around what has happened in the last 12 months. And that needs to happen as soon as possible, and we need to learn those lessons. I think secondly, we need to look, I sit on the Social Security Committee in the Scottish Parliament, and we just have produced a report which comes out in fact today, which has looked at how the last 12 months have affected benefits, and particularly those with disability in regard to that. And I think we are recommending that we need a much tighter system, a system that people understand, and a one-stop basis. But I think the other key thing, and again, there was a debate on this in the Parliament last night, is you're absolutely right, Penny. A lot of care packages were reduced when over the spring and summer of last year. And my fear is that local government won't reinstate those packages, and that puts immense pressure on individuals and on families. And so I think as a politician, if elected, one of the key things I would want to know is, are people not getting their care packages put back in, and make sure that happens for individuals? Because often we can talk about policy at high level, and that is really important, but it's what affects me on the ground, affects other people on the ground. Without my care package, without somebody coming in the morning to help me, I wouldn't be here. I'd be here in my pajamas. So it's sometimes the small things, which seem small, actually make the biggest difference to individual lives.
Thank you very much. And Monica Lennon, I know I've deprived everyone of their 2 minutes intros, but we'll come back to that, but we'll get round to what obviously you perceive as important. But this pressing issue of the pandemic really is the first question to raise. How can we make sure, Monica Lennon, in addition to what's already happening, that this just doesn't happen again as it's impacted disabled people?
Thanks, Penny. Well, I think there will be a lot of agreement today that we need to learn the lessons from the pandemic, and I'm not sure that we've done that, and not just in Scotland, but across the UK and actually globally. So we need to learn those lessons. I do agree that there should be a public inquiry, and wholeheartedly support the Equality and Human Rights Commission, who say that should be human rights focused, and the First Minister has made that commitment, but we've got no idea when a public inquiry will happen. But I think we have to also be careful that we don't just look at everything through the lens of COVID. We have to look at what was happening in people's lives, in our communities, in our public services before COVID came along. And for a long time, budgets have been decimated, and because of that, disabled people have been losing their independence for a long time. And these concerns have been raised for a long time, but people haven't been listened to. And I know the Scottish Government has been very strong on co-production and working with people who have lived experience. But I think where we fall short here in Scotland is around implementation. And that's because we're quite good at strategy and policy, but we don't then have the budget to make it happen and to make sure that good practice has been followed. So too often we hear about postcode lotteries right across the country. So for me and for Scottish Labour, having good national policy and legislation so that people have consistent rights across the board, but having that funding and accountability locally is really key. So you'll hear Scottish Labour talk a lot about funding for local government, but also for the third sector. One of the things that I've been quite consistent on is sustainable funding for disabled organisations. I will declare my interest as a patron of Disability Equality Scotland. But I think on these issues, Penny, you'll get agreement right across the panel. But I think going into this election, what we'll need MSPs on all the benches who are willing to speak up and to call out when we don't have enough action, and when there's a gap between our rhetoric and what we're actually delivering. So we can't fail disabled people and unpaid carers again. That would be criminal.
We'll come back to an opportunity to delve deeper into some of these points that are raised. But first of all, I wanted to hear from Gillian Mackay, please, the Greens candidate for Central Scotland. Gillian, yeah, obviously
Thanks,
with the
Pennie.
COVID issue, but there's the wider context as well.
Yeah, and I think Jeremy and Monica have covered some of what I would have covered myself. But one of the things, and I think this is going to come into a lot of the answers that I'm going to give today, is making sure that we elect disabled people at this election so that they are in Holyrood helping to shape the policy with lived experience and help make these decisions going forward. Monica's point about funding local authorities properly is something that's really important in the context of care, particularly with it currently being outsourced to third parties. There should be a national care service, in my view. And at the moment, the sort of race to the bottom tendering that's going on doesn't help carers. It also doesn't help the people who are receiving the care. And that comes into the wider issue of local authority budgets and things. In terms of more wider things, sort of post-COVID as well, I think keeping a lot of the at-home working, the flexible working arrangements, and everything that we've seen that we were told was too difficult and too costly pre-pandemic, that suddenly when it becomes in the best interests of everyone, these things are perfectly possible and perfectly easy to do. So keeping a lot of that flexibility around COVID and restarting the NHS is something that I think is vital as well, ensuring everybody's ongoing health and building a health service that ensures good health rather than treating bad health is something that we really need to look at and fund going forward as well.
Big shift in focus. We're going to come back to some of those issues because they're raised in specific questions later on. So thank you very much for that. Next, let's introduce Karen Lindsay, Lib Dem candidate for Almond Valley. Hi.
Hi. I think there is going to be quite a lot of agreement across us all today. I think we're all coming from the same place, and I think in my work as a caseworker working in a parliamentary office, what we saw during the pandemic was just awful. Not only the isolation that was faced by disabled people, but also just, stupid things like the social security system. PIP awards that have been granted at tribunal weren't automatically extended in the legislation. It was just a mess, and the government refused to move on that as well, the UK government. And I think one of the things that we have to say and stay very clearly is that if and when a national emergency happens again, we must make sure that the fundamental rights to life and equal recognition before the law and liberty and security and health and independent living, which were just casually disregarded, are not taken away from disabled people again. And I think incorporating the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities into Scots law is really going to help with that. It's really, really important that we do that. And I think Gillian was absolutely right. You've got to have people in the room who can represent and recognise issues of inequality as they emerge. So you have to have disabled people elected to Parliament in numbers. Our former party president, Sal Brinton, she was the first wheelchair user to lead a major UK political party, set up a leadership programme with that aim in mind. We've used all disabled shortlists and things like that. It's important that we do that. Coming back, just adding to what Gillian was talking about in terms of home working and things like that, that is really important to continue. But what worries me is that you have to ensure that people who are working at home for caring responsibilities or for reasons of disability don't then get carved out of the power structures within their organisations. So I think that's that's quite an important thing. But that I also really, we have to have a proper public inquiry that helps us to understand the mistakes that were made during this pandemic, and just make sure they are never ever repeated.
Thank you. Well, so far unanimity over that call for an inquiry. Last but by no means least, Emma Roddick, SNP candidate for Highlands and Islands. Hi, Emma. Before you start, where are you based at the moment? Where are we speaking to you from?
I'm in Inverness.
Oh, hi. Lovely to. We've got people have been telling us where they're joining us from in the chat function, and it's right across Scotland. So very warm welcome to everybody that's taking part. Thank you very much, Emma. Take it away.
Yes, I've noticed in the chat I'm seeing Keith is in Inverness. Hi, Keith. Yeah, I have complete sympathy with the tone of this question. Undoubtedly, disabled people have been disproportionately impacted by the pandemic, undoubtedly. And I want to start by saying that my party has taken the bold move of introducing mechanisms for BAME and disabled candidates, ensuring that the top spot of all of our regional lists are reserved for people who meet that criteria. I'm one of those candidates. This is a pioneering move which has led to international interest from disability organisations, and alongside us establishing schemes like the Access to Elected Office Fund, which provides financial assistance to disabled people running for election, this demonstrates the SNP's commitment to making sure that disabled people are represented at every level of government, which means that we can raise issues like the ones raised in this question ourselves. It's great to see active participation mentioned in the DES manifesto, because that is exactly what the SNP has championed. Everything down to the wording of questions on the Social Security Scotland application forms and the colour of the envelopes that they'll arrive in has been informed by disabled people. So I'll personally be incredibly relieved when the Scottish Government begins delivering the recently devolved disability benefits, because the views of disabled people across the country have helped develop this new system, which puts dignity and respect at its heart. That's in stark contrast to the UK Tory government's constant attacks on disabled people, like excluding many disabled people from the additional £20 universal credit support, and committing what the UN actually described as grave systematic violations of our rights. So I believe that a social security system like ours, one which is actually secure and has been designed by people with lived experience, gives us a far better chance of protection should any event like a pandemic come our way again.
Thank you very much for that. I mean, my question in response to that is that we've talked about participation. We've had some questions coming in that I think relate to that, and I'd like to explore that briefly with you in a little more depth, if I may. It's absolutely laudable, for sure, that we would have more elected representatives right across Scotland representing people with disabilities. What do we do, though, about reaching out to people that haven't got the resources to stand or whatever? You know, how do we actually reach those individuals? Here's a question from Laura Bilton, for instance, who's saying what work's being done to explore, or what work, let's put this in the context of a hustings, what work needs to be done to explore how to include disabled people from Black, Asian and minority ethnic groups who face multiple barriers to inclusion in services. Another question, I don't know the detail behind it, from David Scott, but what's your thoughts on supported decision-making instead of substitute decision-making? And I suspect that that ties up with reaching people directly. Now, surely, if COVID has taught us one thing, it's that we can communicate differently. I mean, look at the number of people that are attending this hustings. There is no hope we'd get this many people in one room pre-COVID. This is opening access. Can we use it better? Emma, I'm going to come back to you on that one, as you raised participation specifically there.
Yeah, thank you. It's a really good point, and I think a lot of us who'd asked for things like home working and virtual attendance at meetings and been told it wasn't possible have been split between being really happy that it's now happening and being really annoyed that it didn't happen when it was us who needed it. But I think we have to I hear a lot of the time in organisations I've previously been involved in, I've said, look, we need to have a more inclusive environment here. We need to make sure that there's no barriers for this type of person to come to us, for somebody who has childcare problems or accessibility issues. And I used to get told so much, well, there's nobody here who would benefit from that. And I think people often get it the wrong way around. Of course, there aren't people here who would benefit from it because we have made it impossible for them to attend. So I think we need to start from a place of inclusivity, because otherwise you're just not going to get all the voices, and we're missing out on a lot of people who have great opinions and a wealth of experience that is currently missing.
Thank you. Karen, Lindsay, yeah, as well as talking about the participation, we've had a question you raised, the enshrining disabled people's rights in law in Scotland. And so I'm going to leave you with the participation thing and we'll pick that up. But also we've had a question about, would you support a transition bill it's going to be debated in the new Parliament, I think, giving a legal right of all disabled young people to a transition plan.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I mean, I don't know if you want to touch on the participation thing, but I'd like to talk to you more about, you know, what law needs to change, in your opinion.
Yeah, I mean that is exactly right. I mean, quite often you will get young people just falling off a cliff when they reach adulthood. I've been through that myself. My son has autism, and we went from a place of having a lot of support to having absolutely none, and having to fight to get things in place. So we absolutely support the actual right to a transition plan for young people when they reach adulthood. It's so unclear that, you know, having seen the consequences in my own life, there is, and I think many of us will be familiar. We just absolutely have to do that.
Thank you. Gillian, you talked about electing more disabled people, and it looks like we're set to have that, aren't we, in Scotland this time around. You know, what do you think, though, about reaching, how do we need to do more to involve, engage, harness the creativity and intelligence of people that know what they're talking about in this field?
Absolutely. We've seen it with climate talks and things. We've had citizens assemblies on climate. There's no reason we can't have citizens assemblies to talk about issues that face disabled people, and the legislation that may be brought forward to help in that instance. That draws on not just the elected disabled people, but disabled people more widely. I know how my own disability affects me. I don't know how many other people's disabilities, or even people's disabilities who fall under the same umbrella as mine, how they affect them on a daily basis. And we can't know everything all the time. And I think as politicians, it's sort of quite important to recognise that, and recognise that there are people out there with lived experience who may have far better ideas on certain things than we do, and involving them in citizens' assemblies or some mechanism like that. And some of the citizens' assemblies have been online. We've found that we can do it, and it's not difficult. So we should be doing it, and we shouldn't fall back into old ways just because some form of normality has returned.
Thank you. And Monica Lennon, that's a good point, isn't it? Because you know, for instance, I hear from unpaid carers that would desperately like to participate, but just cannot. There isn't the support there to enable them to do it. Do we need to think differently about how we involve people, Monica Lennon?
Absolutely. I think we need to do our politics differently. We need bold system change. It's not just piecemeal. And I think in all of these issues, we should be taking an intersectional approach. I think someone made the comment about disabled people's representation and BAME people. So we do need to be more intersectional. I think each of the political parties has to do much, much more. It's not enough to say, oh, we're the party of equality, when you look at your list of candidates, or you look at your local councillors or MSPs, and it doesn't look like the country at all. So every party has to do more. And I'm looking in the chat, I think Frederick has talked about the Inclusion Scotland pilot from 2016, the Elected Office Fund. There's been lots of good schemes and interventions, but I think we still have to be quite honest about the culture of politics, and we do reward presenteeism. So I've been a local councillor, like I know Emma's a councillor, I've been an MSP for the last 5 years, and you have to be switched on 24/7. And that's no good. You know, you see what happens late at night in the House of Commons at 11 p.m. when people are voting on legislation. How can you make your best decisions when you've been working for, 14, 16 hours? And we see that in the Scottish Parliament, actually, where the working day is getting longer. Now, people might think, well, MSPs, they're paid well, and of course we are, but again, are we getting the best out of people? Is it fair on MSP staff, the people who work in our Parliament? And we've seen in this Parliament women who are the same age as me, 40 years old, standing down because they feel that being an MSP and being a minister isn't compatible with being having a family. So I think we've got big questions. I think it's uncomfortable for political parties, but we are part of the problem. And I'm pleased to see in my own party, Scottish Labour, more disabled candidates being selected. But again, we have to make sure when we do these things that we don't just select disabled candidates and put them into slots that are not really winnable. So that's a challenge again for all the parties.
Yeah, thank you so much. And Jeremy Balfour, there's a challenge. Do we need to rethink the way we do politics in Scotland in the light of people having to stand down because they are unable to do their job and live their lives?
Clearly, the Scottish Parliament is underrepresented. I am the only physically declared MSP in the Scottish Parliament. There are two others who have hidden disabilities who have come forward to declare it. Now, I happen to know there are other MSPs that have hidden disability, and I think one of the issues is around stigma, and that's a big issue. People aren't willing to declare that, and I think that's very sad in our country that is still the case. Yeah. I think I would make two quick points. Firstly, I think Monica is right. Not often I say that, I think Monica is right. I think it's not actually, when you get to the Parliament, as a disabled person, I have been looked after really well. They've made appropriate adjustments. They've given me the help I've needed. If I've had to, go away, I needed help, I've been able to take somebody with me, and that's been paid for. I think the issue is, how do we get more people standing who have disabilities?
But also, how do we offer that kind of support to people who simply want to contribute to the conversations that will shape the policy of the future? Shouldn't we be giving individuals the kind of support, Jeremy Balfour, that you've just described you receive in your workplace?
Yeah, I think we should, Penny, and I think we need to look at how we do that. I was going to say, I think all of us, all five parties, have to look at our political structures, how we work, how we get people to join our party, what do we expect when we join. I think I'm probably the oldest person on today. I joined in the late 1980s. I know you won't believe that. And what we expect you to do, Saturday morning, you go out and deliver leaflets. Now, if you've got a disability, how do you do that? That's a lot more difficult. So I think we need to look at our structures. The second thing, I think one of the real advantages of the last year, certainly within the Parliament and within civic society, is that we have learned you don't have
frozen
to come to Edinburgh to be added. So, for example, cross-party group on disability, which I chair, is now online. We've gone from having 30 people there to maybe 70 people there.
Do you see that staying post-COVID?
Well, I think we've just got to say yes to that.
Okay.
And we've got to say yes. So, if Emma is elected, does she have to come to Edinburgh every week to vote? No, she can probably do it online. It's up to her, but she could be given the choice of doing it online and others. So I think we have to look at how we do things. Yeah. But on the other hand, there is still something positive, I think, that we do meet physically together as well, because the danger is that we all end up with social isolation and mental health issues and looking at a screen. So I think there's a balance there.
I want to move us on, if I may. We have a question that's going to be put by Maureen Morrison, who's the manager of Spinal Injuries Scotland. Maureen, I don't know if you are there to pick up a point that we've heard touched upon already. Would you ask your question, please?
Hello, can you hear me?
Hi, Maureen, yes.
I don't think my video's working. Thanks very much, Penny. There has been a lot of concerns about unpaid carers, which is quite a hot topic for us just now. So they're late to be vaccinated, they're overlooked for support, receiving 40 pence an hour for carers grants. I mean, what plans do we really need to put into the future? And I would like to put that to the panel.
Do you have a preference for who you would like to answer that first? It's your choice.
Let me ask Jeremy first.
Thank you, Jeremy Balfour. What are you going to do about addressing the needs of unpaid carers, which it's unavoidable. They're there.
Yeah, I mean, as someone who benefits from an unpaid carer, my wife gives me help. I fully understand the importance of it. I would be tempted one day for all unpaid carers to have 24 hours off and see what society would look like. Because I think that the problem is that many people in our society have no idea what unpaid carers do, what sacrifices they make. And I think it's one of these hidden areas, particularly can be for younger people who maybe care for parents or for siblings, and we just go unrecognised or by and large unrecognised. So I think it's one of the issues is to highlight the issue far more, and I think we need to look at providing proper respite care for carers. We need to look at what do they do. And again, I mean, I think Monica point at the start was, we are good at making policy. We actually are not bad at making legislation most of the time. But it's how does that affect me on a Monday morning in my community? And I think there's a real challenge there in regard to funding. I mean, I think it's disappointing that this government has chosen to cut funding for local government over and over and over. And local government is now being put under pressure of what it can fund. And so I do think we need to re-engage with local government, see the importance of local government, and make sure that they are funded to do the job that they want to do. But I think it's also highlighting the importance of unpaid carers and what we do.
Yes, thank you. Now, we've got 7 minutes left before we break for a very short comfort break, and I'm very keen that you get equal time, obviously. But Emma Roddick, there was a challenge in there to your party, really, that's been in government, but looking to the future. What would you do about, for instance, funding local authorities, supporting unpaid carers in the way that they want?
Well, I have been an unpaid young carer, my little sister, for even longer than me. So this is an issue that is truly very important to me. And I think we also really underestimate the effect of unpaid carers on the people that they care for as well. You feel like a burden, you feel like you're taking up somebody's life. There are probably a lot of people relying on unpaid care who really should be getting community care. And I think a national care service setting expectations and standards could really help with that. Yeah. But just to defend my party's record a bit there, the focus the SNP government has placed on supporting young carers is, to me, incredibly welcome. The Young Carer Grant has been provided to those who are not eligible for carers allowance. Free bus travel is to be introduced for these people, and both of those will drastically improve the lives of young carers. For others, we're increasing carers allowance again, and great importance has been placed on ensuring that respite is available. We're providing £3 million a year to the Short Breaks Fund, and we also support Respitality, who support short breaks for unpaid carers. A range of options for respite is a recommendation in the Feely report of last month. So I believe the action already taken by the SNP in that regard demonstrates our existing commitment to improving the lives of carers.
Thank you. And I absolutely can't count because actually we've got another 15 minutes. So feel free. We've got plenty of time before we break for that break. I wish I could count. It would help. Gillian Mackay, according to Emma there, it's all going to be sorted. Would you do more?
Well, I became an unpaid carer in December. So I absolutely take my hat off to everyone who's been doing it for years and years. I recognise what Emma said about the people you care for feeling like they're a burden, and it's terrible. We would institute a review of disability assistance and carers assistance, which would examine what changes are needed to ensure that the payments meet the 6 conditions established by the Scottish Campaign for Rights to Social Security. We would immediately increase carers allowance top up so that unpaid carers get £105 a week, and double the young carer grant and expand eligibility. We'd also like to look at people who are caring for multiple people who maybe are caring for 2 parents or a grandparent and a parent or something in those realms, and look at how carers grants can be tailored more to them to recognise the value and the task that they are undertaking. But as well as financial assistance, I think there has to be a recognition of the physical and mental impact that caring puts on people, ensuring that unpaid carers have access to flexible healthcare appointments, to make sure they have access to mental health support when they need it before they get to a point of crisis. Because when they reach that point of crisis, or when they reach that point of being unwell, the impact on the people that they care for, and then more widely in society as a whole, is profound. So there's, as I said in one of my previous answers, there's an element of stopping a problem before it starts, rather than a reactionary healthcare and support system, which we have at the moment. Reverting to support and ensuring well-being before we get to the point of crisis, I think is really important.
Thank you. Karen Lindsay, so, yeah, lots of action there, but another review. Do we need more reviews, or do we know what needs doing?
I think one of the things that our UK leader, Ed Davey, has been a carer in many capacities for all of his life. He cared for his terminally ill mum when he was a teenager. He now has a severely disabled son. So he kind of gets it, and it's one of the things that he's really passionate about and wants to be a kind of voice for carers. And one of the things that we're campaigning for across the UK is an increase in carers allowance of £1,000 a year. So go up by that amount across the UK. But we also need to make sure that carers get the support that they need, and young carers particularly need to have better opportunities in education. We need to also recognise, because we know that as the hours you're caring go up, your mental health can go down. So it's like getting that mental health support in right from the start. And actually, one of the things that we managed to secure in the Scottish budget negotiations was an extra £120 million this year for mental health, because it's one of our kind of biggest priorities as a party. I think the innovations in the pandemic that can be built on, so young carers getting e-vouchers and subscription packages and things. There could be more discounts, for example, across kind of sports and culture that they can recognise, that they can access. But the other thing is to make sure that you kind of develop a safety net by way of a system of universal basic income. We called for that at the start of lockdown, and we kind of want to develop that into a permanent feature that can really give everyone a proper safety net. And one of the things as well that we've been thinking about is that we need to make sure that there aren't cliff edges in the financial support that people get following a bereavement. I mean, it takes time to get over that. And after your caring role comes to an end, you need time to get over the grief and work out what you want to do next in your life, whether it's retraining or whatever, and it's really, really important that the system supports people through that. I think the other thing is, again, is more respite care. I think that's a very key feature.
Well, thank you for making that point, because we've had a question from Bernard Anderson. Thank you for that. This is a question for you, Monica. Western Isles Council's just introduced a policy, says Bernard, on respite care, which reduces the maximum respite care from 8 weeks to 6 weeks, and also introduces a needs-based selection criteria, where, according to Bernard, literally no one qualifies for the full 6 weeks. What would the parties do to put a law into a proper respite care policy? Monica, we're coming to the end of this session, so really that's directed. Bernard's asked that to be put to you. What would you do to say, no, we can't pay lip service to this, we've actually got to walk this talk now?
Thanks, Pennie. Well, what Bernard has highlighted in the Western Isles is clearly unacceptable, and I'm concerned to hear that, and it's a worry that could be a trend that's happening across Scotland.
Western Isles, so doing a BBC thing here and saying, you know, this is a claim.
Sure, so we can check that out, but again, I suspect if it is accurate, it will be about budgets, and I think that comes back to Maureen's question, and fundamentally, unpaid carers are getting a raw deal, and it's because they've been undervalued for far too long, and I'm not sure. We are hearing lots of warm words across the political spectrum, but I don't really see an awful lot changing, and I think at the heart of it, it comes down to gender inequality, because the vast majority of unpaid carers are women, and women are not valued in society, full stop. I don't feel I need to explain that point further, but what I would say, of course, the parties haven't all published their manifestos yet. From a personal point of view, because I recently ran to be leader of Scottish Labour but was unsuccessful, but I did say that we need to look towards a social security entitlement for unpaid carers that is equivalent to the real living wage. So I'll still be putting that point forward to my party. I think we have to get into that territory. I think others have touched on young carers. I think that really needs to be given much more attention. I think there are thousands of people in Scotland who don't even know that they are carers, that they are unpaid carers. And I think the issues about stigma are really important. An issue close to my heart is around drug and alcohol harems, and there are tens of thousands of young people in Scotland today who are caring for parents and family members who have alcohol and drug issues, and that's such a hidden issue. So we need to do more to support families who are going through that. I know we're tight for time, but I would just make the point that our economy and our public services would collapse without unpaid carers. So we have to take this really seriously, and I think Linda made the comment, it's not about more reviews, it's about action. And I think all the parties need to be held to account. It's about putting money in people's pockets, but having that wraparound support. And last word would be employers, because we need more flexibility from employers as well. You know, often people feel they have to choose between being a family carer and being in employment, and they suddenly have to leave employment, and then they lose skills, they lose confidence. That isn't acceptable, so we need to change that.
Thank you. Now, you mentioned sort of extending social security to encompass carers. There's a question or a comment here. Now, we've only really got 6 minutes, so I'm asking for very short responses. I'll run through everybody. Do we need one social security system for the whole of Scotland? Asks Dennis Robert Shovlin. Apologies if I've not pronounced that properly. You know, do we need to extend Scotland's control over social security powers? I'm going to ask you, Monica, just to respond in the shortest possible way. That would be great.
Well, I support more powers coming to the Scottish Parliament, so that would absolutely include social security. I think we have to be honest that there have been times when the Scottish Government, the current administration, haven't always used the powers that we do have, and some powers have sat with Westminster for too long. So I think we need to look at that, but absolutely in principle,
thank you.
Powers coming to Scotland.
I'm keen to get round everybody before we break. Karen, Lindsay, more social security powers for Scotland required?
I agree pretty much with what Monica said. I think it's been really, really frustrating for me to have helped people through their PIP reviews 3 years ago, thinking that the next time it would be through a much better system, and to have to put them through the really flawed Westminster system again has been really awful. I definitely support more powers, but actually what I want to see in the next Parliament is us actually using the ones we've got to the absolute maximum. And I know way back in the, when we were in coalition with Labour for the first 8 years, we came up against a kind of roadblock. We didn't have the power to do something. We would just go to the UK government and say, we need this. They would give it to us and we'd just get on with it. So you actually have to use the capacity you've got, I think, as well as getting more.
Thank you so much. Gillian Mackay.
I think for me, the ultimate solution to this is actually a universal basic income, rolling all the benefits into one universal income that ensures that everyone has a decent standard of living. It would replace the benefit system we have, end face-to-face assessments and the sort of prohibitive practices that we have at the moment within the social security system.
Thank you so much. Jeremy Balfour, if I could ask you to respond quite briefly, that would be marvellous. Thank you.
Yeah, I think my biggest frustration is that we have not devolved all the powers that we have. It's going to be 2024, 2025 before all the powers that the Parliament's had. That will be 15 years it's taken to get the social security system up and running. That to me is simply unacceptable. Let's get it done quicker, let's get it working. And I think we also need to look at how we do it. It's interesting, the SNP government are often critical of Westminster, but look at the draft regulations out at the moment, they are identical to what's happening in Westminster. So we're not seeing a change, we just see much of the same, but taking a lot longer to deliver.
Thank you. And Emma, last, but obviously in response to what we've been hearing, that we're not doing enough, we're not doing it fast enough. What's your response to that?
I think it won't come as a shock to anyone that I support more powers coming to the Scottish Parliament. If we have some social security powers and not others, it's confusing, they're not integrated, we're having people have to apply to 2 separate governments for help. One single benefit system, I'm not sure that would work. It would have to be a very good one. The idea behind universal credit was good, but the implementation has been awful. Disability benefits or a disability element should never be included as income like working tax credits. So I do wonder if they would always have to be separate, but absolutely, I think it only makes sense to have full powers over benefits.
Universal basic income, there's a radical idea that would change this landscape dramatically. Could you give us your response to that one?
Yeah, I mean, the SNP's been looking into universal basic income and comparing different ways that it's been implemented elsewhere. So I'm quite excited to see what comes out of that. I know that our Social Justice and Fairness Commission report due out in the next couple of weeks is going to go into that in a lot of detail.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, I am going to call a pause here while we take a 10-minute comfort break. It's genuinely, we'll pick up again at 11 o'clock with more questions posed by what I call real people. Thank you so much for your participation so far. I'm very much looking forward to picking up the discussion in 10 minutes time. See you then. Welcome back to this important discussion about future plans for disabled people among Scottish political parties. Thank you so much for everybody that's participated so far. Really great questions and comments coming in. Keep them coming. This is all going to be captured. So we are now back to discussing the questions that have been put by people. We'll get round to some of the themes that have come in since, and I wonder whether I could ask, please, for a question from Ian Buchanan, Access and Engagement Manager at Disability Equality Scotland. I wonder if Ian is there to ask another important question that's been put in advance. Ian, I can see if you unmute yourself.
Hi everyone. Hi. Sorry, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Perfect. So my question really sort of comes from our network of access panels, and it's really about COVID restrictions. So as COVID restrictions are relaxed, physical accessibility to places like shops and restaurants is going to be so important for disabled people. But we already know that the built environment is far from accessible. And given that the Scottish Government has already rejected the Access Panel's proposals to become statutory consultees alongside community councils, what are you going to do to ensure that disabled people with lived experience are actually going to be central to making the built environment more accessible? Because the Access Panel's asked to be at the heart of decision-making process, but were shut out.
Oh, okay, thank you. Would you like to put that question to one of our panel first, or are you going to leave it to me? I'm happy.
I can leave it to you, Penny. Take it away.
Okay, thank you. Well, I tell you what, I'm going to come to Emma slightly later, if that's okay. Sorry to do this to you, Emma, but I'd like to start with Jeremy Balfour. You're on mute, Jeremy. You're still on mute.
Sorry, Penny.
It's okay.
Yeah, I think that's a really important question by Ian. I think to start with a positive, well, one positive that has come out in regard to this in the last 5 years around planning was the work that I and Mary Fee did around changing place toilets. I think it's a real shame that Mary is stepping down from the Parliament. She has been a very good advocate towards changing place toilets. And I, if I re-elected, will certainly take that one forward. So I think we are now getting at least places that have been built, shopping centres, hospitals, everything like that will have to have a change in place toilet. And I think that will make a massive difference of how people can go out and use these facilities. I think the other issue is, again, the purple pound is so important. And I think this is a message that we need to get across. 20% of the population have a disability. They're the ones that want to go to shops. They're the ones that want to spend their money. They're the ones that want to go on holiday, etc., etc. And we need to speak to retail and tell them that they are losing out if they don't make their places accessible and open. So I think actually the issue is they will have to adapt if they want our money, and if not, we can go elsewhere. And so I think the challenge is, again, for the disability community, although I find that a slightly difficult concept because, as someone else pointed out earlier, we all come with different disability and different experience. But I think the disability community need to be wise in how we use our money. And if there are people who aren't willing to change, then let's go and spend our money in other places. But I do think changing place toilets will make a big difference going forward. And I think we just have to make sure they are built properly, and we need to make sure that people are involved in that process.
Thank you. And Gillian Mackay, from a Green Party perspective, you know, the remobilisation of society, how important is it that the access needs of disabled people are taken into account in that?
Absolutely important. I think what so many people miss is that accessibility means benefit everyone. The accessible things we put in place don't just help the disabled community, they help the elderly population as well. Many parents and things use these accessibility measures as well. So we need to stop, for me, we need to stop seeing it as, and we need society to stop seeing it as something they have to do and something that we should have been doing all along. It's not, this isn't, the access needs that people have are not anything new. It's just that we are now finding a larger voice, finding more platforms to be able to put forward that these issues have to be taken into consideration. And we do, we need to see them more as part of the planning process of public spaces and of how we access these public spaces as well. Getting to shopping centres and culture venues and other things like that is as important as the accessibility we build into these buildings as well. If people cannot get to them, then that's a hurdle in the first place. People with access needs coming into conflict with parents with buggies on buses, with people with bikes on trains. These things are putting different parts of society at odds with each other, and that is something that we should be looking at to ensure that these things are genuinely accessible and not putting people.
We're going to come to travel and inclusive travel, accessible travel, but sticking very much with, you know, the reopening of society. You know, we've got roads in a terrible state. You know, our infrastructure there probably needs some work, according to the people that I'm speaking to. Karen Lindsay, you know, what would you do about that? I mean, it's the fabric of our roads, for instance.
I mean, absolutely, and our pavements are such a mess. If you're trying to get down using a wheelchair, it's really, really difficult. Potholes absolutely everywhere, and that's just partly because of the cuts to local government finance that have gone on, not just during the pandemic, but for years before. Local government is struggling and it needs more funding. And that was one of our priorities, again, to get more money for local government in the budget. But I mean, it's thought as well. I mean, where there was a street in Edinburgh where they put a new speed limit sign in the middle of the pavement. There was no way you were going to be able to get around that if you were in a wheelchair. You had to go out into the road, and it took some doing to get that shifted. But I mean, and the Spaces for People kind of initiative has been useful, but you need to have disabled people in right at the start when you're making these plans to make sure that they work for them, and they haven't been done. You know, there was kind of huge issues in Edinburgh with that. But I think as well, for smaller businesses as well to be accessible, I think you actually need to help. You actually need to, you have to recognise as well that in the past year, business has been completely and utterly, you know, unsupported, not had all the support that it needs. So actually we need to think actually about how we can help small businesses become more accessible, because as Gillian said, it benefits everybody to do that.
Thank you. And Emma Roddick, yeah, that we need to involve more people with an eye on disability and disabled people in designing our communities in terms of coming out of COVID and remobilizing. I mean, is that something you support?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot to this question, so I'm trying to pick the bits that I want to respond to, but the SNP actually brought forward in the 2010 Licensing Act a requirement for applicants to provide a disabled access and facility statement, and I actually support calls to make that information publicly available so that people can plan their journeys, check in advance how accessible premises are. But I'm not saying that would be job done. You know, we know that many premises are simply not accessible. All they have to do is comply with the Equality Act, which is not strong enough on this issue. Unfortunately, equality legislation is a reserved matter. Moving on to what we're going to do, the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities is something that the SNP is already committed to bringing before the next Parliament in the form of a new human rights bill if re-elected. That includes a whole article on disability. I've got here section 2B reads that states parties must ensure that private entities offer facilities and services which are open or provided to the public, take into account all aspects of accessibility for persons with disabilities. So that is what the SNP want to put into law if re-elected in May. I'd like to just touch on as well access panels, because you have my complete sympathy on that. It's something that's affected me a lot as a councillor in the Highlands. We're missing an access panel in Inverness at the moment, and it makes everything a whole lot more difficult. Decisions are made without the input of disabled people, which means they end up hurting disabled people. So yeah, I think we need local access panels. We need to listen to local access panels. And just finally, I've been involved in our Spaces for People discussions because there is a huge opportunity there, giving space back to people, expanding pavements, flattening pavements, getting rid of cambers. Yes, it benefits cyclists and pedestrians, but as Gillian was saying, it also benefits those who use wheelchairs and prams or walking canes, anything.
I wonder, though, about awareness of access panels. This is, we can answer any questions that you might have about those, but Monica Lennon, were you aware of them?
Yes, Penny, and I was one of the committee members on the local government committee who tabled amendments. The issue that Ian raised about access panels becoming a statutory consultee. So I put that forward to the planning bill, and unfortunately that was rejected by the SNP Minister Kevin Stewart, and it was voted down. So hopefully we can return to that in the next Parliament, because I'm pleased to hear others today recognise the importance of access panels. But just more generally, before I came into politics, I was a chartered town planner for over a decade, working in both local authorities or local government and in the private sector as well. And I think fundamentally we need to change our whole approach to design. We don't do inclusive design, really. We might have individual projects that work well, but it's just not baked into how we do design infrastructure and how we look at public procurement and how public investment is spent. So I think we need to see wide change on that. I read last night that the editorial in today's Guardian is all about how we can make our cities and built environments safer for women, and that's in response to the tragic murder of Sarah Everard. But when I read it, I thought, yeah, I agree with every point made, but none of it is new. When I was at university in the 90s, women in planning academics like Dr. Clara Greed and Dory Reeves, who are still around, women like Jane Jacobs many decades ago, were making all these points, and I agree, if we get it right for disabled people, we get it right for women, we get it right for everyone. So why do we read about this in theory, write columns about it, go on social media about it, when there's a moment to try and change society and then nothing actually changes? And again, it goes back to representation, and it's also about budgets, because I think the point's been made today already. We are pretty good at legislation, we are pretty good at policy. It's implementation where we fall down.
And that's about cultures. I hope we get time to go into that, but I want to move us on to accessible travel. And Gillian Mackay, I'm going to come to you because you touched on this point most recently. It's vital to help people live independently, yeah? Accessible travel. Post-pandemic, what plans do all your parties have to increase access to public transport for disabled people? I'm told, for instance, bus toilets aren't suitable for access by disabled people. And critically, would you allow free rail travel for people who are already qualified for free bus travel? I'm going to come to you first, Gillian, on that one.
So personally, I would be supportive of similar concession schemes applying for rail as apply for buses. We want to nationalise ScotRail and bring it back into public ownership and run it for the good of the country. So I think for me that intrinsically means ensuring that people who qualify for bus concession would qualify for train concession as well. In terms of sort of physical accessibility to public transport in particular, to start with, what I've noticed particularly in my own local area is how inaccessible some bus stops are, and the lack of link up between different modes of public transport. The wheelchair accessible transition between Falkirk Grahamston station and the nearest bus stop to go to the likes of Grangemouth is quite some distance, involves an underpass and a ramp and a very narrow pavement, which at the moment isn't suitable for physical distancing. The bus station in Falkirk has now been shut for the best part of nearly 3 years. And the
structure there, that's the accessibility, but actually the ability to go from A to B, is that something that needs work, Gillian? If we could answer, because we've got a lot of questions to come.
Yeah. In terms of the actual sort of physical buses and trains, I think I touched before on the conflict between different users of public transport, in the sense that we need to build in more dedicated spaces for accessible travel that don't come into conflict with bike users on trains, people with buggies on buses. Yeah. And I thought the point on toilets on buses was really interesting, and something that I think I'd really like to speak to a bus builder about, to see how that comes into being accessible.
There's an invitation for whoever mentioned the bus toilets in their original question. You've got an open door there. Thank you, Gillian. Jeremy Balfour, is it realistic, for instance, to suggest free rail travel for disabled people who already qualify for free bus travel?
Pennie, can I take a step back? We can have as good accessible transport as we want, but if you can't get to a bus stop or to a station, it's useless. So
once you've got there...
Yeah, but hang on, Pennie, this is really key, because in January, in Edinburgh, where I live, my street was not cleared once in regard to ice and snow. Nobody from the council came along. That means I couldn't leave my home to get to a bus stop, which meant I couldn't get into the Parliament, I couldn't walk the dog, I couldn't do anything with my kids. Yeah. So I think we need to take a step back before we look at accessible transport.
Okay, but if all those things are sorted, Jeremy Balfour, would you support extending free travel to rail for those who already qualify for buses?
I personally wouldn't. I think we need to get the benefits to the right individuals. I wouldn't go for a universal straight across the board on that one. I would want to direct the money more clearly and more directly. And I think we also have to, again, look at the issue of spaces for people. Again, it's been picked up on in Edinburgh. Often these things are designed with no concept of what it will be. And the other issue is, Pennie, very quickly, we talk a lot, and quite rightly, about those with physical disabilities like myself. Yeah. But we also need to talk about people that have hidden disabilities. What needs to be done in train stations for those that need that extra help, what needs to be done. And I think a lot of it comes down to training for bus drivers, for staff around that. But we need to see this as a whole picture holistically, because we can have the best bus service in the world. If I can't get to it, it's useless.
Yeah, thank you very much. Monica Lennon. So it's local authorities bad again for not, sort of facilitating access to it, but just leaving that to one side, unless you want to pick up on that, obviously. What do you do about increasing the accessibility of public transport for people with disabilities?
Well, I think to go back to the sentiment in the question, accessible transport is vital to help people live independently. And I believe that public transport should be in public hands. It should be a public good. So I think, across the board, we should all be signing up to this. So I think the question touched on, if someone has free bus travel, should they also have free rail travel? I do believe there should be parity there. It's Scottish Labour policy to nationalise the rail service. So we would want to see ScotRail brought into public ownership. But I do take the point that it's no use to have a free bus pass or a free rail pass if the services are rubbish or are being cut back. And that's an issue that we've all seen in our communities, and it's a particular issue in rural communities. So we have to make sure that services are properly funded. But this is not just about throwing public money into things. We have to understand and properly analyse that the benefit to society of doing these things. We all benefit if people can fully participate in our economy, in our society. People not at home, on their own, feeling isolated, feeling cut off. That puts a strain on people's mental health, that puts a strain on the health service. So there's a wider benefit, and it's not about the trains, but where I live, our express bus service between Hamilton and Glasgow city centre has recently been removed. It was a pre-pandemic issue. They got rid of it during the pandemic, and that has a huge impact on people in my community, young people who want to travel from this area into university. But for older and disabled people who've told me that bus service, which takes them door to door right to Glasgow's Royal Infirmary Hospital, that service is now gone. So they will have to rely on taxis, which is not cheap. They will have to rely on friends and families, those unpaid carers that we talked about. So when we do these things, I'm not sure that there's a proper equality impact assessment carried out. And I think the point about local authorities, what I would say is, because I am a strong supporter of local government, and often it is about budgets and funding, but sometimes local government will hide behind that too. So I'm not letting councils off the hook entirely, but I think that we've got to make sure that every part of government in the public sector is playing their part.
Thanks, thank you. Karen, Lindsay, we're getting a lot of comments in on training required for bus and taxi drivers, disability training, including ADHD, autism and other disabilities, awareness raising. Do you think that is a policy that you could pursue?
Absolutely. One of the things that a friend of mine who is visually impaired, she always describes situations where the buses just go right past her, don't stop for her. And that is just appalling. And I think we need to make sure that that bus companies are held to account for, bus operators are held to account for those sorts of things going wrong. It's absolutely terrible. And listening to Sal Brinton, my friend, talk about her experiences travelling up and down the country as president of our party, taking the train and being stranded because somebody's forgotten to come and help her off it at midnight in King's Cross, places like that. We cannot allow those sorts of things to happen, and we have to sort them out. But one of the kind of radical things that we're kind of offering in this election is actually giving communities the power to decide where their buses go. Because I think that is something that will actually really help disabled people. So, so the buses will go where the community needs them to, not where the bus companies make the most profit. And that's going to help ensure that issues with accessibility, for example, can be addressed quickly, because people will have a direct route to make changes, and you don't have to deal with an arm's length company who will only need to make changes if it suits them. So those are the sorts of things. I mean, it's just so important, because
over to you. Here we've heard all sorts of calls, including nationalising our public transport providers. Bringing them back. That, according to some, is one way of ensuring that change happens. What is the SNP position on that?
Well, I love the word nationalisation. Yeah, I completely back that. And it's just overall, such an important question. We know that disabled people don't travel as often or as far as the rest of the population. So clearly there are systematic barriers at work here that need to be broken down. Particularly where I'm from, isolation is a huge barrier, not only but particularly to disabled people. The SNP's expanded the concessionary travel scheme most recently to companions of young disabled people. So now around 1.3 million people benefit from free bus travel. But of course, I recognise that the bus is not an option for everyone. Buses can be really unreliable, timetables are out of date, and sometimes it's easier for me to walk slowly into town rather than stand in the rain for 45 minutes. My late mother, for the last 10 years of her life, there was no chance we could have got her onto a bus. It would have to be a train. So even putting toilets aside, trains are often far more accessible for those with mobility problems or sensory issues. I have the disabled person's rail card, but I appreciate more than most that even a third of a regular rail journey is quite a chunkier pip gone. I think the most important factor in making sure disabled people are not excluded from travelling independently is ensuring that we're included in discussions around public transport and how it needs to improve. I'd promote the importance of audio and visual information being provided, real-time trackers so that there's updates on breakdowns and service changes, and all the way to physically more accessible vehicles to all service providers, just to make sure that travelling by public transport is a viable option for disabled people.
This is a hot topic. It's our chat and our Q&A functions are alive with it, and people talking about being able to travel more spontaneously, etc. So I'll commend us all to read those afterwards. But we're running out of time, believe it or not, and an awful lot of big meaty questions still to ask. So I wonder whether we can maybe rattle through some of these responses with key headlines. Stigma is something I really want to address. Increased social stigma being reported by disabled people, particularly post-COVID. Reports of verbal abuse growing, particularly in relation to people who, because of their condition, can't wear a mask, for instance. They can't wear a face covering. Do you have any specific plans for addressing stigma against disabled people and tackling the way that basically Scotland perceives disabled people, you know, and how do we recognise the values of this enormous community? I wonder if I can start with Monica Lennon there.
Thanks, Penny. Just trying to find the mute button there. It's really upsetting to hear and to see how prevalent stigma still is, and I know from the work that I do closely with Disability Equality Scotland and the weekly surveys of members that hate crime is still an everyday occurrence, particularly on public transport, which we've just been talking about. So I do hope that, although it's never a silver bullet, I do hope that the Hate Crime and Public Order Bill, which has just been passed by the Scottish Parliament, will give additional protection and will be a stronger deterrent and a message out there to perpetrators that there is no hiding place.
That's an extreme end of it. People are reporting this on a daily basis in their communities. I mean, to have the evidence to take a case like that is a huge ask of somebody.
And it's underreported because people don't believe that they will be believed, that they will be supported.
So what do we do about, you know, what would Labour, Scottish Labour, for instance, do to try and tackle some of that, the stigma that surrounds people with disability in Scotland? And I wonder if I could I'm sorry to do this because these are huge questions, if you could make it tight.
Sure. It's hard to do it justice in a few words, but I think if we want to put aside legislation, then it has to be about education. That has to start, you know, at a young age in schools. I don't believe that children grow up hating people because they're different or disabled. So what is it about our society where we start to treat people badly? So I think education is key, but I think if disabled people are more prominent in public life, are represented at the top of government and in Parliament and in our local councils and in boards and in the private sector, then it will get easier. But it's taken too long, Penny, so I think we all need to think about ways that we can speed this up. I think legislation is key, but it's much more than that.
Thank you. Karen Lindsay.
Well, I think one of the most exciting things about incorporating the Convention on the Rights of Disabled Persons is that it gives an obligation on the state to promote and make and show the positive contribution that disabled people make. And I think that's incumbent to do so. And I think it's about making sure that disabled people have the opportunity to tell their stories. I mean, our Vice President had a big webinar last Thursday where she, called "What's It Like to Be a Disabled Person in Britain Today," and that's available to watch. It's a great event, but it's about getting the perpetrators, but also giving making sure that disabled people have access to positions of power at all levels.
Thank you, Emma Roddick. Monica mentioned education there. doing something to change societal attitudes. What do you think is top priority?
Yeah, education is important, but I think a lot of it is de-education. People have learned these behaviours, and it's such a tough question for me because I'm on the receiving end of this kind of abuse daily at the moment due to the disability mechanism. It ranges from people using my disability to prove that I'm not suitable for elected office, to strangers demanding I share medical information as a condition for them to stop harassing me online. I wish I had an easy answer because I'd be doing it. But I think a lot of the abuse comes from a place of not understanding and therefore having a lack of empathy. I wish it was easy to teach people empathy. Unfortunately, it isn't. But if elected, it would be a daily part of my work to challenge ableism, to raise awareness of my experience and others' experience, and to make sure that the law, which is there to protect people, is doing its job and not tolerating offences which are motivated by prejudice towards disabled people. The SNP, we have a track record in pursuing equality for disabled people, so I'd continue to press for powers on equality legislation to be given over to Scotland, and indeed every other power, so that we can better address issues like this. And in the meantime, I'd support our new human rights bill.
Thank you. Gillian Mackay, how do you tackle stigma from a Green perspective?
I think we have to recognise that the stigma, and ultimately in part the ignorance that we're talking about, is systemic. It's in a similar way to Monica was saying about many of the women's issues that have been raised recently with the murder of Sarah. These things are systemic. It's going to take a systemic change. I'm going to sound like a broken record. At this election, one of the most powerful things you can do is elect disabled MSPs. We then need to work together to raise disabled people's issues within Holyrood. Bring our party colleagues along with us and raise these issues at every opportunity we are given. These issues,
call out abuse whenever it happens.
100%. The abuse I'm seeing Emma take online is horrendous, and I'm as someone who is at the top of their own party list and a disabled candidate and isn't taking the abuse that Emma is taking, it's heartbreaking to see that happening.
Find people then as individuals, yeah. Jeremy Balfour, I was struck when the questions came in from people originally to inform this discussion. There was a distinct feeling that the Conservatives carry some of the blame for stigmatising people with disabilities because of attitudes to, for instance, people on benefits and, cutting benefits, etc., etc. There's a real sentiment out there. Is it something you recognise?
I recognise the sentiment. I don't accept the sentiment. I think if you actually look at what my colleagues down in London have done around benefits, around delivering things, particularly over the last 12 months, which hasn't happened within Scotland, I think that is a perception that is not fair. I, although born with a disability and had a disability all my life, wasn't in contact with a lot of disabled individuals growing up. And I have come to this new over the last 5 years as an MSP. My perception is we in the disability community are where women's rights were in 1950s. I think we're about 50, 60 years behind where we should be. And where I agree with Emma is I don't think there's a silver bullet to this. There's not one quick answer to it. It's going to be a generational thing, challenging society, challenging our colleagues around this and driving that agenda forward. I would say, if you haven't watched, go to the cross-party group on disability, the last one. We looked at the whole issue of hate and how the police and the Crown Office are dealing with it. And I think there's some positive messages coming out from that and ways forward in regard to that. There's a lot to be done, and there's not an easy answer. But I do agree we need to challenge society and we need to challenge our colleagues on it.
Thank you. Now I'm going to take a question from Catherine Hughes, involvement member at the Alliance. I'd be really grateful if both the question and the responses could be snappy, because this our slot is running out of time fast. Catherine Hughes, are you there?
I've just bumped up the panelists, so we'll see if we get her.
Okay, if Catherine's not there, then
yeah, I'm here.
Hi, Catherine. How are you?
Yeah, I'm here.
Actually, I've not got time to answer that question. Just go for it.
So my question is to the candidates: will they support the creation of an individual self-management fund to help to support individuals with the costs that are associated with the self-management of people's long-term conditions, to help improve their health and well-being?
Thank you.
I mean, for myself, that's encountered over a substantial 5-figure sum over the cost of my long-term conditions. So it's really important.
And you won't be alone, Catherine. Thank you so much for your question. And this ties up, I think, with the Feely report, into the the review of adult social care in Scotland published recently, that called for far more investment in self-directed support, so that people, for instance, can put together their own care packages rather than having to take what they're basically offered. Or given. Okay, I'd like to start with Emma. Okay, self-directed support and Catherine's point there about the funding for it.
Sure, and the Social Care Self-Directed Support Scotland Act in 2013 was actually brought forward by the SNP government. So we are already committed to promoting and supporting self-directed support, and have been for many years. We also funded the Independent Living Fund after its equivalent was scrapped by Tories down south. That fund allows people to live how they want to and pay for the care that they want.
But it hasn't
the Feely
been
report
working here, though, has it? It hasn't
well,
been working like it could.
It's been described in the Feely report what we've done already as a scaffolding upon which we can build better, and the report actually describes the actions we already taken as groundbreaking. So yeah, I think it was the SNP who established.
The legislation's groundbreaking. The implementation of it, I think, left a lot to be desired. Is that accepted?
Well, sure. I mean, it was the SNP who established the Feely review, so I think it's us who can deliver on it.
Yeah, thank you very much, Monica Lennon. Yes. So not only self-directed support, but let's focus on that. National Care Service as well.
Well, absolutely, and we agree with the points that Catherine has raised. We work closely together on the cross-party group on chronic pain. I think what Feely said is that we need far more investment in self-directed support. So again, fair play to the SNP government for bringing it in, but we can't do these things on the cheap and expect to get good outcomes. So I think that needs to be the test for candidates and parties in this election. It's not just making the commitment, it's having the budget to follow it through.
Would Labour fund that? Would Labour fund all those recommendations and fund proper self-directed support?
Well, in this election, we're making care and social care a fundamental priority. We lobbied for a national care service. It's been our policy for 10 years, but we're in opposition, which means you can't do an awful lot. And we do need transformational change. So it's because of our campaigns last year with the trade union movement that we did get the Feely review, and we welcome that. But we do need to see a national care service that isn't just a slogan. It needs to be something that is shaped and designed by the people of the country. We need to have national rights, but it needs to be delivered locally, and it needs to be locally accountable. But again, if we bring this forward and we don't fund it properly, we're not going to get the good outcomes that people deserve.
So would you put the money in that would address Catherine Hughes's issues? We heard about her personal financial commitment to her own care. There will be many, many others, many people who can't afford to do it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, self-directed support is crucial to person-centred care and giving people autonomy over their own lives. So I'm agreeing with the Feely report that to do it properly, it needs to be funded, and that's what's missing. That's the big issue here.
Thank you. Catherine Hughes is pointing out that not everyone with chronic long-term conditions or disabilities can access self-directed support or social security benefits. An individual self-management fund would be slightly different for everyone to assist them with self-management. Would you, are you for that?
I mean, I think it's fair to say that self-directed support has not lived up to people's expectations. It was supposed to give care users more control, but as we've seen, that's not the experience. And one reason for that is that it relies on there being genuine kind of choice available. And there's a lot of unmet need and staff and resource issues. And that means it's a case of having to really fight hard for what you get with these services. And the Feely report had really important recommendations on how to improve this. And we want to get on with this as quickly as possible and really drive through that investment necessary so that the independent review's kind of vision of better care actually comes to fruition.
So you put them on there.
Yeah, we need to put the money there, and actually, to be honest, we would rather put the money into that than into creating a national care service, which we think will share the kind of problems that have the same problems as we saw with the centralisation of police.
So you don't think a national care service is necessary then, the kind of Feely vision of it?
No. That's the one place where we diverge. We think it's going to cause more problems than it actually solves.
And is there an alternative? Is it carrying on as normal?
It's a national investment, but locally, locally managed, because we think that services are better managed. Just as a point of principle, as Liberal Democrats, that services are better managed closest to the people who use them.
Oh, that's very interesting to hear a different perspective, and I'm sure that could be the subject of a whole other 2 hours. Gillian Mackay.
So I think it's interesting, subsidiarity in making decisions as close to local people as possible is a fundamental part of green politics. But there are services like the National Health Service and a National Care Service are ones that I feel a National Care Service is something that we need. Self-directed support absolutely needs funded properly. Absolutely does. I think there's some elements of people taking on their own care that need and directing their own care that need challenged as well. I've spoken to some disabled people who one of the barriers to doing self-directed care is that they have to become, in some instances, they have to become the employer for the caregivers that they receive. That's adding an extra burden onto them or they're unpaid carers that isn't something that they should be having to take on. So I think that needs looked at as well. But yeah, all for self-directed care and support. And I think some of the personal expense and things that Catherine pointed out, I think universal basic income is another way and another element to supporting people more generally as well.
Okay, thank you. And Jeremy Balfour, self-directed support, and Catherine's point there.
Legislation, absolutely good, doesn't need changed. Implementation, we need an absolute sea change in how local authorities, how social workers, how civic society see it. It's not for everybody, self-directed support. There need to be different models available.
Sound like they could be, more modifiable in individual circumstances.
Yeah, and I think that's the danger. We need to look at individuals. It goes back to a point I made at the start, that any system must work for the individual. And one of the things that I'm very keen to do is, if I get back, would be to see some kind of social work cross-party group set up within the Parliament, and for that to look at things like self-directed payments.
But more reviews. People
No.
People are pretty bored with more reviews.
I don't want reviews, I want action. And I want education for social workers, and I want to see a cultural change within local authorities who say, we know best, we'll do it for you. What I want is individuals to be in charge.
Would you put more money into it? Would you put the dosh into it that it's going to need?
Well, I actually think the money is there, it's just not being used properly. So I think before we put more money in, let's actually get the money down to the individuals And I think that there's a blockage there, that the money is there, it's simply not getting to the people in the right way.
Are you a supporter then of the Feely report's kind of thrust that there would be a national care service determined centrally, delivered locally?
Yeah, I think that's I won't say any more, we're running out of time. Great summary.
Thank you. Now, as I said, we have very many huge questions that we could talk about for hours. We have 15 minutes left in total. Somebody's raised the question of housing, which I really wish we had the time to go into. And maybe, you know, we can reflect on that in this last answer. The question here is about remobilizing NHS and care services post-COVID. I'm going to have to ask you to be really tabloid in your answers to this to get it into time. But, you know, now that vaccination's being rolled out and the end of the pandemic is in sight, and I'm crossing everything, what would you prioritise in remobilisation of NHS and care in Scotland? Karen, I'm going to come to you first.
So I think, first of all, I think we need to kind of address the shortfalls in staffing that are seen through the health and care service and were before the pandemic. Shortage of GPs, specialists, a really overburdened workforce who are now exhausted after the traumas of the last year. So we really need to sort that out. But our huge priority to focus on is mental health. There were 2-year waits for mental health treatment before the pandemic struck, and that is devastating. And, you know, I speak from personal experience in terms of my child having to wait for a year to be seen. And that was years ago. And we fought for mental health at every opportunity in the Scottish Parliament, and just won really 120 million pounds in the most recent budget. So basically, we need to get on with the improvements that Feely identified as well by avoiding centralisation and just make new early progress in the next Parliament with new kind of care standards, and also more local health services as well, so that people can access things in their own communities.
Thank you. Gillian Mackay, what would you prioritise in remobilisation? We're talking NHS and care services. I think you, when we started talking, talked about getting upstream, you know, getting into prevent ill health.
Yeah, so I think the remobilisation immediately and the services that we need to restart quickly, and that vision of a sort of preventative health service are maybe, they do have to happen sort of concurrently, but I think remobilising the care service in general is something, and getting people back to the level of care provision they had before the pandemic, or ensuring that they have the care service that they need in order to be able to live their life, is essential. I would like to see the NHS shift focus towards preventative measures rather than reactive healthcare. But things like the NHS screening programmes need to be remobilised. And although we call them routine procedures, many of these routine procedures that a lot of people have been waiting for have caused a lot of pain and problems during the pandemic. Routine things can cause a wide number of problems for people, and that's sort of the immediate things I would like to see, as well as that shift towards a more preventative healthcare system.
Thank you. Jeremy Balfour, here's William Hendren saying, you know, he hasn't seen his support worker for 13 months. When we talk about remobilising, you know, the telly's full of what it means for people with cancer. We talked about mental health, etc. When are we going to see, you know, what you're going to do about remobilising, you know, support?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the key thing for many disabled people, is getting the care packages back to where they were at the start of last year. And I think that has to be the key thing. And we have to make sure that they are not reduced or taken away. The other thing I think we need to get back is for some people to go to a community centre, to go to a place that they can have socialisation opportunities to improve their skills. We need to get them open again and up and running as soon as possible. But I do think, and I agree with Caroline on this one, that I do think mental health for those with disabilities as well is going to be a key issue. And I think we need to make sure that people have opportunities, as well as with physical disabilities, that the whole issue of mental health is going to be a massive one. I just think people are living under a massive strain. It's funny, I was talking to one of my friends, and they're living under a strain, and until you come out of that, you don't actually realise how stressful it's been. And I think that could be a massive long-term consequence. So we need to make sure that that is there and available.
Thank you. Emma Roddick, for whoever, holds power in the Scottish Parliament after May the 6th, the remobilisation issue is going to be a huge challenge. What would be your personal priorities from your perspective as a disabled person?
I think the backlog of elective surgeries is going to be a tough thing for the NHS to handle. In the Highlands, we have a new elective care centre on the horizon, expected to open next year. And I'd like to see a lot of focus on making sure people who have waited a long time for hip ops are seen to as soon as possible. An issue that has been raised with me a number of times is that there are many, not just people with mental illness, but all type of neurodiverse people out there who've had to wait a long time for potentially life-changing and life-saving appointments, particularly where they are children. I would like to see them get reviews, assessments and treatment as a priority.
Okay. Thank you so much. This is going to be ongoing discussion, I think. And last but by no means least in that particular question, Monica Lennon.
Well, I think what we should try and do is capture the really good innovations that have happened, across the NHS workforce. The staff have been absolutely fantastic, and we've seen a lot of innovation and service redesign. So I think we have to cling on to the good innovation and what works and roll that out. But as others have said,
more telehealth, for instance, more video conferencing, more remote consultation.
Yes, but I think we have to be careful that is not always the right thing for individuals. And, when I speak to GPs, they tell me that actually doing the video consultation takes considerably longer. So it's not really a time saver. And we don't have enough GPs. So again, there's a place for technology and virtual consultations and so on, but it's not going to be for everyone. So that touches on the workforce issues that others have mentioned. But I think for me, it's how we get through that backlog of care. It's going to be so challenging. And again, if I can give the example of where we had a great piece of legislation from the SNP through the treatment time guarantee, but that law was broken hundreds of thousands of times. So I think what people want in this election is honesty, because the public are realistic. We can't do everything, we can't do it quickly, but where people are at most risk, like cancer, I'm really concerned about the people who, in terms of diagnostics, that there are delays, and we know that getting that early diagnosis is critical to people's survival chances.
Like pain clinics end up down the bottom of the heap. Is there a danger of that, Monica? I'm going to ask you to answer in about 30 seconds on that one, if that's okay.
So I would prioritise chronic pain, Penny, and I also would say, and I've raised this with ministers over recent months, is that for those patients who have desperately travelled to private clinics in Birmingham and elsewhere, they should be reimbursed, and we do need to remobilise chronic pain services across the country.
Thank you so much. Now, we are 6 minutes from the end, and I think this one's a really important question, but you're going to have to answer it really pretty snappily, i.e. you've got about a minute each. Are your manifestos, and Emma, I'm going to come to you first, are your manifestos going to prominently feature the needs of disabled people, and will they be available in a full range of accessible formats? And as a supplementary, why should a disabled person and all their carers vote for you? Emma, I'm going to come to you first.
Well, in the SNP, we are absolutely committed to inclusive communication. We have BSL interpreters at all our national events and quiet rooms, and we have a track record of providing our manifesto in accessible formats. As for why people should vote for us, well, many of you will know what I mean when I say that having a disability or looking after someone with a disability means you've taken on a part-time job. You're an activist, a secretary, and a professional complainer. And sometimes you phone the GP, you have to write a letter of complaint to the NHS, an organisation, your employer, you have to order a new aid, and it's silicone, and it costs 50 quid for some reason. And the thing that's hit me most since being elected is when you see a policy and you think, how did that get through? Surely somebody in the room pointed out how exclusionary it is. I'm that person in the room, and I think, who was it before me? The SNP firmly believes that nothing should be done for disabled people without disabled people, and that's why it's placed me and other candidates at the top of its regional lists, to make sure there is always that person in the room.
Thank you. I'm going to move on. Jeremy Balfour, I mean, literally a minute. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I hope our manifesto will appeal to those with disability. I haven't seen the final version, but I've seen drafts, and I'm sure it has clear areas.
I'll make a special request.
But we will have certainly clear areas around that, and I think if you're not happy with it, then come back and challenge me. Come back and challenge my colleagues. I think clearly for me, there are two issues within this election coming up. Clearly, the constitutional question. If you don't want to be independent, then clearly I think we have a party to vote for. And secondly, we need a party that's going to rebuild the economy so that there's money there to be distributed to those that need it most.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Gillian Mackay.
So I'm quite proud of the draft that I've seen. Again, ours isn't in complete form yet. I'm very proud of the manifesto that I've seen so far, because I think it recognises how intrinsically issues of disabled people.
But yeah, thank you.
That's all right. Issues of disabled people come in.
Vote for you, Gillian, for the Greens.
Because we need more disabled people in Holyrood. We have a real chance of getting our first ever green MSP in Central Scotland, and I would love for it to be a young disabled woman who's also an unpaid carer, who will go in, smash it, and work with all the other disabled MSPs to get our issues to the front and centre of the Holyrood Chamber.
Good shout. Thank you for doing it so quickly and so well. Karen Lindsay.
Firstly, because we'll support carers financially and with respite care and mental health support that we need. We'll put the recovery first and not waste another few years with an independence referendum and consequent arguments. And the other thing, I think the most important thing is that as Liberal Democrats, we understand individuals and community. So we don't believe in a one-size-fits-all approach. We recognise that we're all individuals, and what suits one person may not be right for another. So we really get the value of making sure that each person gets the support that they need.
Thank you. And Monica Lennon for the last word. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, our manifesto will be published very soon, but in terms of the work we've done to finesse our policies, we've worked closely with disabled people's organisations and stakeholders right across Scotland. So hopefully our policies reflect the people's priorities. We're putting recovery at the front of our election campaign. And when we talk about COVID recovery, we recognise that not everyone has had the same experience. We haven't all been in it together. Some people were already really struggling before the pandemic. So if you vote for Scottish Labour, you're not voting for the austerity that we've had for over a decade from the Tories, and with the SNP, some great policy, but the gap between rhetoric and record is huge. So I'm standing in Central Scotland, like other people, very passionate about the issues discussed today, and I think we need a parliament of minorities so that we can actually get some stuff done.
To an end. Apologies if there's been any imbalance in the time, but I think you've all made your points really powerfully. Thank you. Sorry for cutting you off there, Monica, but I'm very keen that we finish absolutely on time. I wanted to thank very much Disability Equality Scotland for organising a fantastic 2 hours where we've been able to dig into some really pretty chunky issues. Many, many more raised in chat and Q&A. All this information is going to be shared. We've recorded these discussions. So it's hit 12 o'clock according to my clock, and I never overrun. Thank you so much. Good luck.
Thank you.